Long before the written word carved history into stone, stories were the threads that wove humanity together. Picture this: a flickering fire in the heart of a village, where elders spun tales of gods and heroes, of creation and chaos, passing wisdom down through generations like an unbroken chain. These weren't just stories, they were the heartbeat of civilizations, the invisible glue that bound communities across time and space. From the epic of Gilgamesh etched on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia to the Dreamtime narratives of indigenous Australians, storytelling has always been more than entertainment. It's how we've made sense of the world and our place in it. What if I told you that hidden within these ancient myths are secrets that still shape us today? Think about the stories you grew up with, the moral fables, the heroic quests, even the cautionary tales whispered to keep children from wandering too far. These narratives didn't just emerge from thin air. They're echoes of traditions thousands of years old, carrying the hopes, fears, and values of countless generations. Why do certain themes like the underdog's triumph or the trickster's cunning appear in cultures oceans apart? How did a story told by a Greek bard 3,000 years ago find its way into the blockbuster movies we watch today? The answers lie in the cultural significance of traditional storytelling, a force so powerful it transcends borders and bridges the gap between past and present. This journey we're about to take isn't just about unraveling the mysteries of old tales, it's about discovering what they reveal about us. Together, we'll trace the footsteps of storytellers from the Silk Roads of Persia to the icy sagas of the Norse, uncovering how these narratives shaped empires, sparked revolutions, and even healed divides. We'll see how a single story, like the tale of the phoenix rising from ashes, can inspire resilience in cultures from Egypt to China. And perhaps most importantly, we'll explore how these ancient traditions still speak to us, offering wisdom in a world that's never needed connection more. So settle in, because the stories we're about to share aren't just relics of the past. They're living, breathing guides to understanding who we are and who we might yet become. The earliest storytellers left their mark not with words, but with images, handprints pressed onto cave walls in ochre, mammoths etched into stone by firelight. In places like Lascaux and Chauvet, these breathtaking galleries from 20,000 years ago weren't just art. They were humanity's first attempts to say, "This happened." This matters. Some scholars believe these caves were sacred spaces where shamans recounted creation stories, their flickering torchlight bringing the painted bison and horses to life as the first special effects. But storytelling wasn't confined to Europe. In Indonesia, a cave painting of a pig hunt dates back 45,000 years, proof that across continents, our ancestors shared an irresistible urge to turn experience into narrative. What's astonishing is how these early stories solved practical problems. Before science, myths explained why the sun traveled across the sky or how diseases spread. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia mapped their entire landscape through songline stories so precise they could navigate hundreds of miles by memorizing verses. Meanwhile, in Africa, the San people's oral traditions preserved knowledge of medicinal plants for generations, embedding survival wisdom in tales of the trickster god Kagan. These weren't just fanciful yarns, they were ancient Wikipedia, libraries of survival coded in narrative. Archaeology keeps revealing how universal this impulse was. In Turkey, clay tablets from 9,000 years ago show the world's oldest known proto-writing, symbols of gods and harvests that may have been mnemonics for oral storytellers. Halfway across the world, the Ojibwe tribe's birch bark scrolls used pictographs to record migration histories, while the intricate knotted strings of Inca quippers may have encoded narratives alongside numerical data. Every culture, it seems, invented its own technology to preserve stories long before paper or ink existed. These early narratives became the DNA of civilization. The flood myth found in Gilgamesh, it echoes in the Bible, the Quran, and indigenous Australian lore, suggesting a shared human memory of cataclysmic events. The hero's journey template, seen everywhere from ancient Sumerian epics to modern movies, likely began around campfires where elders taught young hunters courage through metaphor. Even today, when we binge a series or gasp at a plot twist, we're tapping into neural pathways forged by ancestors who understood that stories don't just entertain, they wire us for empathy, problem-solving, and collective memory. As villages grew into cities, storytelling evolved too. The oral poets of Mesopotamia became court historians. Egyptian hieroglyphs turned myths into state propaganda. But the core purpose remained, to bind people together through shared meaning. That's why the next chapter in this tale isn't just about quills and parchment, it's about how stories became the currency of power, the spark of revolutions, and ultimately, the mirror that shows us our own humanity. Imagine holding an entire library in your mind, every history, every lore, every epic poem preserved not in ink, but in memory. That was the reality for societies built on oral traditions, where storytellers weren't just entertainers, they were living archives. Take the Griots of West Africa, revered figures who carried the genealogies of empires like Mali and Songhai in their songs. A single griot could recite centuries of history, tracing lineages back to Sundiata Keita in the 13th century with pinpoint accuracy. Their secret, a rigorous apprenticeship lasting decades, where every pause, every intonation was perfected. These weren't just performances, they were acts of cultural survival, ensuring that even without written records, no king's deed or ancestor's wisdom would fade into silence. Half a world away, Aboriginal Australians perfected another form of memory technology, Dreamtime stories. Woven into songs, dances, and intricate dot paintings, these narratives mapped the land itself, encoding navigation routes, water sources, and seasonal cycles into allegories of ancestral beings. A single story about the rainbow serpent might explain monsoons, warn of floods, and reinforce kinship ties, all while being passed down verbatim for over 50,000 years. Researchers found that these oral maps were so precise, indigenous guides could locate hidden springs in the desert using only the lyrics of ancient songs. Then there were the Norse scalds, poets who turned history into hypnotic verse. A well-trained scald could recite sagas like Beowulf or the prose Edda for hours, their alliterative rhythms acting as mnemonic glue. A misplaced word wasn't just a mistake, it was heresy. When Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson finally wrote these tales down in the 13th century, he admitted they'd been preserved orally for twice as long as America's existed as a nation. Yet today, this fragile art faces extinction. In Mali, griot families struggle as smartphones replace firelight gatherings. In Australia, climate change erodes the very landscapes Dreamtime stories describe, severing the link between tale and terrain. Linguists estimate a language and its oral traditions dies every 2 weeks. Projects like the Endangered Languages Archive now race to record elders' voices before they fall silent. But can a digital file ever capture the tremor in a griot's voice or the way a shaman's tale shifts with the seasons? This tension between preservation and evolution sets the stage for storytelling's next revolution. When scribes in Mesopotamia pressed cuneiform into clay, they didn't just record myths, they transformed how humanity thinks. Suddenly, a story could outlive its teller, traveling across deserts and oceans without distortion. But something was lost too, the warmth of a shared breath in a darkened room, the improv of a skald tailoring a saga to his audience's gasps. As we turn the page to writing's rise, ask yourself, can ink truly replace the human voice, or does every new technology give with one hand while taking with the other? The moment humanity pressed stylus into clay, storytelling transformed forever. In the bustling city-states of Mesopotamia around 3200 BC, scribes began etching wedge-shaped marks into damp clay tablets, not just inventories of grain or sheep, but something revolutionary, the world's first written narratives. Among these fragile tablets lay fragments of a tale that would echo through millennia, the epic of Gilgamesh. Imagine holding a piece of this 4,000-year-old story, where a king's quest for immortality mirrors our own fears and dreams. This wasn't merely recording words, it was bottling lightning, capturing the ephemeral magic of oral tales in permanent form. Egypt's scribes took it further, weaving stories into the fabric of power. Hieroglyphs adorning temple walls told tales of gods like Osiris and Isis not just as myths, but as divine justification for Pharaoh's rule. The pyramid texts, carved in burial chambers around 2400 BC, turned storytelling into a sacred act, guiding souls through the afterlife with spells woven as narrative. Meanwhile, along the Yellow River, Chinese oracle bones from the Shang dynasty revealed how writing began as divination questions to ancestors etched onto turtle shells, evolving into histories like the Bamboo Annals. Each civilization discovered that written words could do what oral stories couldn't: freeze a thought in time, letting it travel across deserts and centuries unchanged. Scribes became the unsung heroes of this revolution. In Mesopotamia, they trained for years in Aduba's tablet schools where a single misplaced wedge could mean a beating. Their painstaking work preserved not just Gilgamesh, but legal codes like Hammurabi's, where stories of justice were literally set in stone. Egypt's scribes enjoyed elite status, their reed pens documenting everything from medical papyri to the satirical tale of the shipwrecked sailor, proving even ancients loved adventure stories. And in China, the meticulous brushstrokes of scribes turned the I Ching into both a philosophical guide and a narrative compass for emperors. Yet writing didn't kill oral tradition, it danced with it. Greek bards still sang Homer's epics centuries after the alphabet emerged. India's Vedas were memorized orally for over 1,000 years before being written down. The real power of writing lay in its ability to standardize stories, turning local folktales into cultural cornerstones. When Sargon of Akkad commissioned his victories to be inscribed, he wasn't just recording history, he was crafting propaganda, using narrative to unify his empire. The same pattern appeared in China's Mandate of Heaven or Egypt's divine kingship tales. Stories became the glue of civilizations, justifying laws and legitimizing rulers. This marriage of narrative and power sets the stage for history's most enduring paradox. The very technology that preserved stories also controlled them. Temple libraries decided which tales survived. Royal decrees dictated which heroes were celebrated. As we turn to how storytelling shaped empires, consider this. Every law, every constitution, every national myth is, at its heart, a story we've agreed to believe. And sometimes the most powerful stories aren't those written in ink, but the ones written into the bones of a culture, whispering through generations long after the clay tablets crumble to dust. From the moment the first kingdoms rose, rulers understood something profound: whoever controls the stories controls the people. Take the Ramayana, India's ancient epic. On the surface, it's the divine Prince Rama's quest to rescue his wife Sita from the demon king Ravana. but look deeper and you'll find a masterclass in political storytelling. By casting Rama as the ideal ruler, just, brave, and devout, the epic became a blueprint for Hindu kingship. Emperors like the Gupta dynasty in the 4th century CE commissioned lavish illustrated manuscripts, tying their reigns to Rama's divine legitimacy. Temples from Tamil Nadu to Cambodia carved scenes from the epic into their walls, subtly whispering, "This king is like Rama, his rule is ordained by the gods." Rome wielded narratives just as deftly. When Virgil penned the Aeneid under Emperor Augustus, he wasn't just writing poetry, he was crafting propaganda. The tale of Aeneas fleeing Troy to found Rome tied Augustus's reign to mythical heroes, suggesting his rule was destiny fulfilled. Coins minted with Aeneas's face circulated alongside Virgil's verses, blending art and authority. Even the Roman calendar was tweaked to align with Aeneas's fictional journey, turning time itself into a testament to imperial glory. But stories weren't just tools of the powerful, they were weapons of the oppressed. Enslaved Africans in the Americas spun Biara rabbit tales, where a small, clever trickster outwitted stronger foes. On the surface, children's fables, beneath, coded lessons in resistance. Similarly, Jewish communities during the Spanish Inquisition preserved their identity through oral folktales disguised as Christian parables, hiding their true beliefs in plain sight. The most potent stories live in this tension between those who wield them to crown kings and those who use them to topple thrones. When the Haitian revolutionaries chanted songs of the African spirit Ogu in the 1790s, they weren't just invoking a god, they were resurrecting a narrative of liberation older than their chains. And when Filipino nationalists staged plays about the pre-colonial hero Lam Ang during Spanish rule, they weren't merely entertaining, they were quietly rehearsing revolution. This duality reveals storytelling's ultimate power. It can uphold empires or unravel them, often within the same breath. The next chapter in our tale isn't just about ink and parchment. It's about how stories, once confined to courts and temples, burst into the world stage, carried by pilgrims, merchants, and rebels. Because the moment a story slips its leash, it becomes something far more dangerous, an idea that no army can truly suppress. Folktales are like secret handshakes passed down through generations, a wink and a nod that says this is how we survive together. Take Aesop's fables, those deceptively simple tales of talking animals. A fox tricks a crow into dropping its cheese. A tortoise outlasts a hare. On the surface, children's stories. But peel back the layers and you'll find a survival manual for the ancient Mediterranean world. The fox's cunning wasn't just entertainment, it taught peasants how to navigate the whims of powerful landowners. The tortoise's perseverance, a coded lesson for enslaved people enduring oppression. These stories thrived because they whispered hard truths in ways tyrants couldn't punish. The brothers Grimm collected similar tales centuries later, but with a twist. Their versions of Cinderella or Hansel and Gretel weren't the sanitized Disney renditions we know today. Original drafts featured mothers, not stepmothers, abandoning children, and Cinderella's stepsisters cutting off their toes to fit the slipper. Why so brutal? These were stories forged in the fires of Europe's famines and wars, where survival often meant harsh choices. The Grimms weren't just preserving folklore, they were documenting the raw nerves of 19th century German society, where hunger lurked in every shadow. Yet across oceans, the same themes emerged with different flavors. In West Africa, Anansi the spider, a trickster who often outsmarted himself, taught the Ashanti people that brains trump brute strength. Japan's Momotaro, the peach-born boy who defeated ogres, reinforced values of teamwork and loyalty in a culture that prized collective harmony. Even the Native American tale of Coyote and the Stars, where the clever coyote accidentally scatters stars across the sky, blended humor with a lesson about unintended consequences. Every culture's folktales were mirrors, reflecting their unique struggles and virtues back at them. What's fascinating is how these stories morphed as they traveled. The Indian folktale of the tiger's whisker, about a wife patiently taming a wild beast to heal her husband, became a Korean parable about perseverance. The Chinese legend of the butterfly lovers, a tragic romance, inspired Japan's Tanabata festival with its own star-crossed lovers. Each retelling wasn't just translation, it was reinvention, bending the story to fit new landscapes and values. But beneath the moral lessons lurked something darker. Many folktales began as warnings: don't wander into the woods, don't trust strangers, don't anger the spirits. The original Little Red Riding Hood wasn't a bedtime story. It was a medieval cautionary tale about the very real dangers of wolves and predatory men in rural France. Slavic Baba Yaga tales with her hut on chicken legs weren't just whimsy, they embodied the perilous unknown of Russia's endless forests. These stories didn't just teach morals, they carried the collective trauma of generations, the scars of plagues and invasions and natural disasters etched into narrative. That shadowy undercurrent sets the stage for folklore's most haunting question. What if some tales weren't just fiction, but distorted memories of real events? When every culture has a flood myth or a story of giants, could they be fragments of ancient catastrophes or lost civilizations? The line between folklore and history blurs in the realm of the unexplained, where stories stop being lessons and start being mysteries waiting to be unraveled. Mythology isn't just about gods and monsters, it's humanity's first attempt to explain the unexplainable. Picture the ancient Greeks staring at a lightning bolt splitting the sky and imagining Zeus hurling his thunderbolt from Mount Olympus. Or the Norse watching the aurora borealis and seeing the shimmering armor of Valkyries guiding souls to Valhalla. Every culture, faced with the same awe-inspiring natural phenomena, wove its own tapestry of meaning. The Hindu god Indra commanding rainstorms, the Mesopotamian Tiamat embodying the chaos of the sea, the Maori goddess Papatuanuku forming the earth beneath their feet, these weren't mere fantasies. They were profound metaphors, turning hurricanes into battles and eclipses into omens, helping people navigate a world far stranger than they could comprehend. What's striking is how these myths reflect the values of their creators. The Greek pantheon, with its squabbling, flawed deities, mirrored the messy politics of city-states like Athens and Sparta. Meanwhile, the Egyptian gods, orderly and eternal, reinforced a society obsessed with balance and the afterlife. Compare that to the Aztec belief in Huitzilopochtli, the sun god demanding blood sacrifices to keep the world alive, a chilling metaphor for an empire built on conquest. Even the celestial bodies weren't spared. The Chinese saw the moon as home to the immortal Chang, while the Inuit imagined it as a lonely hunter chasing the sun. These stories did more than explain nature. They encoded cultural priorities into the very fabric of the cosmos. Yet beneath the surface, eerily similar patterns emerge. Nearly every civilization has a flood myth: Noah's Ark, Manu's boat in Hinduism, the Sumerian Ziusudra suggesting shared memories of ancient cataclysms. The hero's journey template, whether in Hercules' labors or the Hindu Ramayana, reveals a universal blueprint for human resilience. Even trickster figures like Loki, Anansi, or Native American coyote pop up worldwide, proving that every culture needed a symbol of chaos to challenge the status quo. Fast forward to today, and these archetypes haven't vanished, they've shape-shifted. Superman's origin echoes Moses in the bulrushes, Star Wars Jed, I draw on samurai and knightly codes. Marvel's Thor is straight out of Norse myth, while Black Panther's Wakanda taps into Afrofuturist reimaginings of pre-colonial glory. Why do these ancient templates still resonate? Because they speak to primal human questions about power, morality, and identity, just repackaged for an age of streaming and comic books. But mythology wasn't just about grand cosmic drama. For ordinary people, these stories were survival tools. Farmers planting crops by the phases of the moon weren't just following tradition. They were acting out celestial myths that tied harvests to divine cycles. Sailors avoiding storms knew Poseidon's wrath wasn't just a tale. It was a warning etched into generations of seafaring lore. Even children's bedtime stories about spirits in the forest or rivers guarded by nymphs served a practical purpose, keeping them from dangerous places. This seamless blend of the supernatural and the everyday sets the stage for storytelling's most surprising twist. Beyond gods and heroes, narratives quietly shaped history's most mundane yet vital realms: trade routes, legal systems, even medicine. Because when a story isn't just heard but believed, it doesn't just explain the world, it changes it. Long before textbooks or classrooms existed, rituals and ceremonies were humanity's original classrooms, where stories weren't just told but lived. Take the Native American Sun Dance, a ceremony so sacred it was banned by colonizers for its power. As dancers moved for days without food or water, elders recounted creation stories, tying each step to the movements of the universe itself. The Lakota people's vision quests weren't solitary trials. They were narrative journeys where adolescents returned with stories that would define their roles in the tribe. These weren't performances, they were soul-deep lessons, etching wisdom into bones through the alchemy of pain, rhythm, and shared breath. Half a world away, Japanese no theater turned storytelling into a meditative art. Performers in carved wooden masks moved like ghosts through tales of love and vengeance, their slow, deliberate gestures honed over centuries. A single play might last 6 hours, blending Shinto beliefs with Buddhist philosophy, where the boundary between actor and spirit blurred. The audience didn't just watch, they participated in a collective trance, as if the story's magic could seep into their skin. Even the masks held power. A slight tilt could shift a character from sorrow to rage, proving that the oldest special effects weren't digital but human. Seasonal festivals wove stories into the very fabric of time. The Celtic Samhain, ancestor of Halloween, wasn't just about warding off spirits. It was a night when the veil between worlds thinned, and families gathered to recite genealogies like living history books. In West Africa, the Yoruba people's Egungun festivals featured masked dancers embodying ancestors, their swirling fabrics becoming portals to the past. And in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries used secrecy as a narrative tool. Initiates underwent rituals so profound that even today, we can only guess at their stories, whispered only in darkness over 2,000 years ago. What made these ceremonies endure wasn't just tradition, but their genius for merging story with sensory experience. The smell of sage in a sweat lodge, the thunder of taiko drums in a Japanese matsuri, the taste of bitter herbs during Passover. Each element anchored the story in the body, making it unforgettable. Modern science confirms what elders knew instinctively. Multisensory experiences create stronger memories. A study of Aboriginal Australian children found they could recall complex navigation stories with 95% accuracy after just one telling, because those tales were paired with touch, song, and the feel of the earth beneath their feet. This fusion of narrative and ritual reveals storytelling's hidden superpower, its ability to shape identity. When a Maasai boy in Kenya kills his first lion and returns to sing his story in a warrior's chant, he isn't just boasting, he's stepping into a role crafted by generations of similar stories. The Jewish Passover Seder, where children ask, "Why is this night different?" isn't just a meal, it's a time machine collapsing centuries so that each generation tastes both the bitterness of slavery and the sweetness of freedom. Even Japan's tea ceremonies, with their choreographed rituals, are stories in motion about harmony, respect, and the fleeting beauty of a single moment. As these traditions show, the most potent stories aren't those we hear, but those we inhabit. They live in the sweat on a dancer's brow, the tremor of a shaman's voice, the hush of a firelit circle where time itself seems to bend. Which makes you wonder, in our age of streaming and scrolling, have we lost something vital? The next chapter in storytelling's evolution might seem like a departure, the rise of written words and schoolrooms, but look closer and you'll find the same ancient magic hiding in plain sight. Because whether carved on temple walls or scribbled in notebooks, stories never stop being the heartbeat of how we learn who we are. Some of history's greatest teachers understood a secret. The best way to make wisdom stick isn't with lectures, but with stories that linger in the mind like riddles. In the misty monasteries of ancient China, Zen masters perfected this art through koans, those paradoxical questions designed to shatter ordinary thinking. A student might spend years pondering what is the sound of one hand clapping, not because there's a correct answer, but because the struggle itself rewired their perception. These weren't puzzles to solve, they were mental grenades exploding assumptions to reveal deeper truths. Meanwhile, in the oak groves of Greece, Socrates spun his own version of teaching tales, using allegories like the cave to illustrate how reality might be mere shadows on a wall. His genius lay in never handing out answers, only stories that forced his students to dig for meaning themselves. India's Panchatantra tales took a different approach: animal fables, so cunning they could teach statecraft to princes and morality to children simultaneously. A story about a clever jackal outwitting a lion wasn't just entertainment. It encoded lessons about diplomacy, resourcefulness, and the dangers of arrogance. Scholars believe these tales traveled further than any textbook, carried by merchants along the Silk Road to Persia, where they became Kalila wa Dimna, then hopping to Europe as Aesop's fables. The brilliance of these narratives, they wrapped sharp truths in velvet, making bitter pills of wisdom easier to swallow. At the heart of this tradition stood the wisdom keepers, those entrusted with guarding and dispensing knowledge through story. Tibetan Buddhist monks memorized thousands of Jataka tales about the Buddha's past lives, each one a lesson in compassion disguised as a fable. West African griots recited genealogies through epic poems, turning dry family trees into thrilling sagas of love and betrayal. Even Pythagoras, better known for his theorem, required his students to sit in silence for 5 years before teaching them through symbolic stories about numbers as living entities. These elders knew something modern education often forgets: facts fade, but a well-told story etches itself into the soul. What's fascinating is how these teaching tales adapted to their audiences. Jesus' parables of mustard seeds and prodigal sons resonated with agrarian communities, while Sufi mystics like Rumi used spinning wheel metaphors for urban artisans. The Japanese art of Hanashika storytelling with folding fans turned Buddhist sutras into dramatic performances for illiterate villagers. Every culture developed its own narrative toolkit, but the goal remained the same: to make the abstract tangible, the complex simple, the mundane magical. Trade routes became the invisible universities spreading these stories worldwide. When Persian caravans stopped at caravanserais, merchants didn't just exchange spices and silk, they swapped tales. A Jataka story from India might morph into an Arabic kissa by the time it reached Morocco. Chinese papermakers, whose invention made books portable, unwittingly became patrons of this global storytelling network. Even the humble game of chess, born as an Indian teaching tool for military strategy, evolved into a European allegory for medieval social hierarchy, proof that stories could hide in plain sight, disguised as entertainment. This cross-pollination created something extraordinary, a shared vocabulary of wisdom that transcended borders. The same themes: patience rewarded, pride humbled, kindness repaid, echoed from Kyoto to Jerusalem to Timbuktu, each culture dressing universal truths in local color. Perhaps that's why these ancient teaching methods still resonate today. Every TD talk that opens with a personal anecdote, every business guru framing leadership lessons through heroes' journeys, even children's shows like Sesame Street using puppets to teach numbers, they're all heirs to this timeless tradition. Because when you strip away the centuries, the most effective education isn't about information, it's about transformation. And nothing changes us like a story that whispers, "Listen closely, this is about you." The bustling caravans of the Silk Road carried more than silk and spices. They were mobile libraries, their saddlebags stuffed with stories that would crisscross continents like whispered secrets. Picture a Persian merchant in a Samarkand tea house, entertaining traders with tales of Sinbad's voyages, only to have a Chinese scribe jot them down centuries later as the Arabian Nights. Or Buddhist monks slipping Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's past lives, into the luggage of spice traders, where they'd morph into Persian fables and eventually European fairy tales. This was storytelling's first global internet, where narratives traveled faster than empires could conquer, adapting like linguistic chameleons to each new tongue and tradition. Take Kalila wa Dimna, a collection of animal fables born in India around 2,000 years ago. Originally the Sanskrit Panchatantra, these stories hitchhiked with merchants to Persia, where scholars translated them into Pahlavi. By the 8th century, Arab scribes reimagined them as a manual for princes, complete with philosophical debates between jackals named Kalila and Dimna. By the time these tales reached Spain in the 13th century, they'd shed their Sanskrit roots entirely, becoming Kalila-e-Dimna, proof that stories, like water, take the shape of whatever vessel holds them. Yet through every transformation, the core lessons endured. Cleverness triumphs over brute force, greed leads to ruin, and power must be tempered with wisdom. The real magic lay in how these stories morphed to reflect their new homes. The Chinese version of the Indian Vetalapankavamsati 25 ghost stories gained Taoist immortals and Confucian virtues. Persian love poems absorbed the structure of Indian ragas, while Greek Aesop's fables sprouted Buddhist morals in Central Asian retellings. Even 1001 Nights, often seen as purely Arabic, contains Indian, Persian, and Mesopotamian layers, like a literary archaeological dig. Scholars call this process cultural refraction, where stories bend to fit local values without breaking their essential light. But this exchange wasn't always peaceful. When Mongol armies sacked Baghdad in 1258, they inadvertently scattered scholars and their stories across Eurasia like dandelion seeds. The Persian poet Rumi, whose family fled the invasion, ended up in Turkey, where his Sufi parables blended Christian mysticism with Islamic teachings. Similarly, the destruction of India's Nalanda University sent Buddhist monks carrying sutras and Jataka tales surging into Tibet and China. Violence, ironically, became an accelerant for narrative spread, forcing stories to migrate or perish. Yet for all this cross-pollination, something profound was lost in translation. Sanskrit wordplay evaporated in Persian, Chinese tonal poetry flattened in Arabic. The rhythmic cadence of a Bengali folktale recited under banyan trees couldn't survive the stark cliffs of Central Asia. That's why the most resilient stories weren't those with the prettiest phrases, but the sturdiest bones, universal themes of love, betrayal, and redemption that could wear any cultural costume. This golden age of narrative exchange, however, was about to face its greatest threat. As European colonial ships replaced camel caravans, they brought not just goods and guns, but a new kind of storytelling, one that sought to overwrite rather than adapt. Indigenous tales from the Americas to Australia were labeled primitive, their keepers silenced or coerced into abandoning oral traditions for printed Bibles and grammar books. The same trade routes that had once spread stories like wildfire now carried the sparks of their potential erasure, setting the stage for storytelling's next great struggle, not just to travel but to survive. When colonizers' ships landed on foreign shores, they carried more than weapons and disease. They brought stories designed to conquer minds. Across the Americas, Africa, and Australia, missionaries burned birch bark scrolls, banned drum languages, and punished children for speaking native tongues. In Canada, the residential school system severed Indigenous children from their stories, replacing Cree legends with Bible verses and turning Anishinaabe creation myths into forbidden whispers. The goal was clear: to erase not just people but the narratives that held their identities together. A Tlingit elder once described it as burning the library of a culture, because when you destroy a people's stories, you unravel their sense of who they are. Yet some stories refused to die. In New Zealand, Maori elders secretly preserved their Whakapapa genealogical chants by embedding them in lullabies sung to children under colonial radar. The Haida people of the Pacific Northwest carved their oral histories into totem poles, knowing colonizers might cut them down but couldn't silence the symbols. Even the grim boarding schools meant to assimilate Native American children became unintended archives. When Zitkala Shah, a Yankton Dakota writer, published her memoirs in the early 20th century, she smuggled out stories of resistance disguised as personal essays. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were quiet rebellions proving that stories could outlive suppression. Today, that resistance has blossomed into full-fledged reclamation. The Hawaiian language, once down to fewer than 2,000 native speakers, is now taught in immersion schools where children learn through Oli chants about Peel's volcanic fires. In Norway, the Sami people are digitizing yoik songs, melodic stories so personal they're considered sonic portraits of people and landscapes, using AI to analyze patterns nearly lost to forced assimilation. Australia's Aboriginal communities are mapping songlines onto GPS systems, merging 40,000-year-old navigation stories with modern technology. Perhaps most powerfully, Indigenous storytellers are flipping the script on colonial narratives. Maori filmmaker Taika Waititi injects ancestral humor into Hollywood films like Hunt for the Wilderpeople, while Inuk throat singer Tanya Tagak reimagines old tales through avant-garde music that vibrates with primal energy. The Cherokee Nation recently launched a language app teaching words through traditional animal stories, ensuring that even in the digital age, these narratives remain living threads rather than museum exhibits. But this revival faces stark challenges. Of the world's 7,000 languages, nearly half are endangered, and with each one that falls silent, entire universes of story vanish. When the last speaker of the Yagan language in Tierra del Fuego died in 2020, a mythology comparing stars to dolphin hunters disappeared forever. That's why initiatives like the Endangered Languages Project matter. They're not just archiving words, but safeguarding ways of seeing the world. A single Navajo word like Haja beauty/harmony carries philosophies that take paragraphs to translate, proving that some stories resist being told in any tongue but their own. This tension between loss and renewal sets the stage for storytelling's next frontier. As virtual reality headsets recreate Cherokee villages and algorithms reassemble fragmented Mayan codices, technology isn't just preserving old stories, it's becoming the new campfire where they're shared. The question is no longer whether these narratives will survive, but how they'll evolve as they dance between tradition and innovation, between memory and the uncharted possibilities of the digital age. The glow of smartphone screens might seem like the antithesis of a campfire's flame, but look closer. Today's digital platforms are breathing unexpected new life into humanity's oldest art form. YouTube creators spinning horror stories by flashlight, podcasters weaving serialized mysteries, even TikTokers stitching together collaborative fairy tales. These aren't just modern distractions. They're the 21st century's answer to the Griots drum circle or the Viking Skald's Mead Hall recitals. What's fascinating is how these formats unconsciously echo ancient patterns. Take the viral phenomenon of creepypastas, those user-generated horror tales like Slender Man or The Backrooms. These stories spread through forums and videos, mutating with each retelling like a digital game of telephone, mirroring how folktales evolved as they traveled between villages centuries ago. The same communal energy that once shaped the Odyssey's oral versions now fuels Reddit threads where thousands collectively build dystopian universes, one comment at a time. Even the algorithms curating our content feeds are unknowingly replicating oral traditions' rhythms. Spotify's podcast playlists function like digital campfires, gathering listeners for serialized stories, much like Inuit elders held audiences wrapped with multi-night sagas of Sedna, the sea goddess. YouTube's Part 2 autoplay echoes the cliffhangers Persian dastangos used to keep bizarre crowds returning. And when Instagram Reels compress Aesop-style morality tales into 15-second snippets, they're distilling fables for the attention economy just as Bronze Age storytellers trimmed epics to fit a shepherd's lunch break. The mediums have changed, but the neural wiring that makes us lean in when someone says, "Let me tell you a story," remains untouched by time. This digital renaissance also offers something unprecedented: the power to resurrect nearly lost traditions. The Sami people of Scandinavia now share yoic songs via apps that teach the melodic stories to younger generations. Cherokee speakers use virtual reality to immerse learners in ancestral tales where trees speak and rivers remember. Even the ancient art of call and response storytelling thrives in Twitch streams, where live audiences influence narratives through real-time chat. Technology isn't just preserving these traditions, it's giving them new adaptive strategies, like grafting ancient olive branches onto digital rootstock. Yet for all these innovations, the fundamental psychology remains unchanged. MRI studies show our brains don't just process stories, they simulate them. When we hear about a character running, our motor cortex lights up as if we're sprinting too. This neural mirroring explains why a well-told YouTube ghost story can raise arm hairs just like a shaman's tale around embers. It's also why brands increasingly use narrative techniques, because our minds are wired to remember information wrapped in stories far better than raw facts. A Stanford study found statistics alone persuade only 5% of listeners, but when embedded in narrative, retention soars to 65%. No wonder pharmaceutical commercials now frame drug benefits as patient journeys rather than bullet points. They're tapping into the same neural pathways that once made cautionary tales about forest spirits so unforgettable to Bronze Age children. What emerges is a paradox. The more high-tech our world becomes, the more we crave the primal connection of shared narrative. Podcasts like The Moth prove this, where ordinary people stand on stages telling true stories without notes, a format that would feel familiar to medieval troubadours. The explosive popularity of audiobooks signals our enduring love for the spoken word, even as e-books gather digital dust. Perhaps this explains why, despite having infinite entertainment at our fingertips, we still instinctively gather around metaphorical fires, whether those are Netflix watch parties, Discord book clubs, or viral Twitter threads unfolding like serialized cliffhangers. The mediums evolve, but the magic persists. That moment when a voice says, "Once upon a time," and for a heartbeat, the modern world falls away, leaving only the ancient, irresistible pull of a story about to begin. This enduring power sets the stage for storytelling's most fascinating frontier, not just how tales are told, but how they literally rewire our brains. Because when we unpack why certain narratives survive millennia while others fade, we're not just studying art, we're decoding the operating system of human connection itself. Our brains don't just process stories, they crave them like oxygen. Neuroscience reveals why, when we hear a compelling narrative, our neurons fire as if we're living the events ourselves. A Harvard study showed that descriptions of lavender fields activate the olfactory cortex, while action sequences light up the motor areas. This isn't passive listening, it's full body immersion, a biological echo of our ancestors huddled around fires, internalizing survival lessons through communal tales. Stories aren't entertainment, they're cognitive tools, carving neural pathways that help us rehearse emotions, solve problems, and bond with others before we ever face real-world challenges. This hardwiring explains why children who grow up hearing family stories develop stronger resilience. Psychologists at Emory University found that kids who knew their grandparents' immigration narratives or parents' overcoming adversity tales had higher emotional intelligence and coping skills. These intergenerational self-stories act as psychological armor, whispering, "You come from people who endured, so can you." Therapists now harness this deliberately, using narrative therapy to help patients rewrite traumatic experiences as journeys of growth. A war veteran reframing combat memories as stories of camaraderie rather than terror, or an abuse survivor reclaiming their voice through written memoirs, these aren't just healing techniques. They're proof that storytelling doesn't just describe our lives, it shapes them. Education systems are catching on. Finland's schools, ranked among the world's best, teach history through personalized diaries of historical figures rather than dry timelines. Medical students at Columbia University diagnose fictional patients in narrative-based curricula, boosting diagnostic accuracy by 30%. Even NASA trains astronauts with what-if scenario stories, priming their brains to react calmly to emergencies they've only ever imagined. The ancient Greek concept of mimesis, learning through imitation via story, is now backed by fMRI scans showing that narrative-based lessons create denser memory networks than rote memorization. Brands and media exploit this neural hijacking ruthlessly. A Coca-Cola ad doesn't sell soda, it sells a mini-movie about friendship and nostalgia. Apple's origin story frames its products as tools for rebels and visionaries, tapping into the same hero's journey template as the Odyssey. Even news outlets increasingly use story arcs for complex issues, knowing viewers retain more about climate change when it's framed as a looming thriller rather than statistics. The most viral TED Talks, those structured as personal narratives with stakes and transformations, not data dumps, yet this power carries ethical weight. The same mechanisms that make stories transformative also make them dangerous. Conspiracy theories spread because they offer simpler, more emotionally satisfying narratives than messy realities. Political polarization thrives when competing camps inhabit entirely different story universes about justice or freedom. Recognizing storytelling's double edge invites a crucial question. In an age where narratives can be weaponized by algorithms, how do we harness their connective power without falling for their divisive potential? The answer might lie not in abandoning stories, but in becoming more discerning architects of the tales we tell and believe. Look closely at any Marvel movie or Studio Ghibli masterpiece, and you'll spot storytelling blueprints older than the pyramids. That moment when Iron Man sacrifices himself in Endgame, it's a beat-for-beat replay of the Norse god Odin hanging himself from Yggdrasil for wisdom. The wandering spirits in Spirited Away mirror Japanese folktales about yokai haunting bathhouses, while Black Panther's Wakanda channels centuries of Afrofuturist oral traditions. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that modern screenwriters still drink from the same narrative well as Homer and Scheherazade. Take the hero's journey template, a structure Joseph Campbell identified in myths worldwide. Luke Skywalker's Star Wars arc follows it religiously. Ordinary farm boy called to adventure, trained by Obi-Wan mentor, faces Darth Vader ordeal. But this isn't just a Hollywood formula. Compare Luke to the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh, a king who befriends Enkidu mentor, battles Humbaba ordeal, and quests for immortality return with elixir. The parallels reveal something profound. Whether carved on clay tablets or projected in IMAX, humans crave stories about transformation. Even The Matrix borrows its chosen one plot from Hindu avatars and Buddhist tales of enlightenment, swapping meditation for bullet time. Global franchises thrive by localizing these universal bones. Marvel's Shanghai wove Chinese wuxia traditions into its fight choreography, while Coco repackaged Mexico's Dia de Muertos as a musical odyssey. Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke dressed up Japanese Shinto animism as an ecological fable, and Mona resurrected Polynesian wayfinding chants as Disney showstoppers. The genius lies in balancing familiar structures with cultural specificity, like serving ancient narrative nutrients in new flavor wrappers. Businesses now exploit this same psychology. Nike ads don't sell shoes, they sell mini heroes' journeys about overcoming adversity. Apple's 1984 commercial framed Max as rebellion against conformity, echoing Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. Even corporate training modules disguise lessons as quests, complete with mentors and challenges. The lesson: whether you're a bard or a brand, stories remain the ultimate delivery system for ideas because our brains are still wired to respond to a well-told tale like our ancestors did to firelight sagas of gods and monsters. As storytelling evolves into virtual reality and AI-generated plots, one truth endures: the narratives that stick are those tapping into primal templates, then draping them in the textures of their time. The next chapter of this tale isn't about pixels or algorithms. It's about how we'll reshape these ancient patterns to navigate futures we can't yet imagine. Every successful brand you can name has a mythology woven into its DNA, not just logos and slogans, but stories that tap into something deeper than commerce. Think of Apple's legendary garage origin, where two college dropouts changed the world with circuit boards and a dream. That narrative didn't just sell computers, it cast customers as rebels joining a revolution, transforming mundane gadgets into symbols of counterculture. Or consider Coca-Cola's masterstroke in the 1930s, when they hired illustrator Haddon Sundblom to reinvent Santa Claus. His rosy-cheeked, Coke-drinking Saint Nick didn't just boost winter sales, it overwrote centuries of European folklore to create an American Christmas icon, proving that corporations don't just sell products. They sell worlds, but this alchemy of branding and storytelling walks an ethical tightrope. When Starbucks borrows the aesthetic of Italian espresso bars or Disney repackages European fairy tales as animated blockbusters, where does homage end and appropriation begin? The line blurs further with brands like Urban Outfitters, accused of lifting Navajo patterns for hipster fashions without tribal consent. Even well-intentioned campaigns risk reducing living traditions to marketing props. Imagine a fast food chain using Aboriginal songlines to sell burgers, stripping sacred narratives of their context. The backlash against such moves reveals a cultural immune response. Stories aren't just intellectual property, they're the lifeblood of identity, yet some brands thread the needle brilliantly. Patagonia's "Don't Buy This Jacket" campaign flipped consumerism on its head by wrapping environmental activism in a paradox, earning trust through radical honesty. Lego's revival of Norse mythology in its Viking sets didn't just entertain kids, it partnered with Scandinavian historians to honor source material while sparking new interest in Eddic poetry. These examples show commercial storytelling at its best, not extraction but symbiosis, where brands amplify rather than exploit the stories they engage with. This tension between commerce and culture sets the stage for storytelling's highest stakes arena, social change. Because when narratives aren't just selling sneakers but challenging injustices, they become something far more potent weapons of hope. From the pamphlets of the abolitionist movement to the hashtags of Black Lives Matter, the right story told at the right moment doesn't just reflect society. It rewrites it. Stories have always been the secret fuel of revolutions, not just the grand speeches or manifestos, but the raw, personal narratives that make injustice impossible to ignore. Take the #MeToo movement, which didn't begin with policy papers or press conferences, but with two simple words shared by millions. When survivors began recounting their experiences in tweets, essays, and courtroom testimonies, something shifted. These weren't just individual stories, they formed a collective roar that toppled empires of silence, proving that a single voice might be dismissed, but a chorus can rewrite laws. Similarly, climate activists like Greta Thunberg didn't just cite statistics, she framed her crusade as a generational story, asking, "How dare you?" in speeches that echoed the moral urgency of ancient prophets. Her power lay not in data but in narrative, a child calling out the failure of elders to protect their future. Documentaries have amplified this alchemy, turning personal struggles into cultural turning points. An Inconvenient Truth didn't just explain greenhouse gases, it framed climate change as a thriller with a ticking clock, while 13th wove historical archives and modern interviews into a damning indictment of systemic racism. Even viral social media stories, like the video of George Floyd's murder, become modern-day slave narratives, unflinching testimonies that force societies to confront what they'd rather ignore. These stories don't just inform, they implicate, creating emotional connections where facts alone fail to penetrate. History's greatest movements understood this power. Frederick Douglass's autobiography wasn't just a memoir, it weaponized his story to dismantle slavery's justification. The blues songs born in Mississippi cotton fields doubled as coded protests, their sorrow masking fury. During India's independence struggle, folk theatre troupes performed plays about mythical heroes, subtly equating them with Gandhi's resistance. In each case, stories became Trojan horses, smuggling radical ideas into the mainstream under the guise of art or tradition. What makes these narratives so potent is their ability to bridge divides. When a Syrian refugee's Instagram posts humanize a crisis reduced to headlines, or when indigenous activists use TikTok to explain land rights through ancestral stories, they're not just broadcasting, they're inviting empathy across chasms of difference. The same mechanism that once helped traders on the Silk Road exchange folktales now lets a teenager in Nairobi and a grandmother in Norway cry over the same documentary. Stories don't erase boundaries, they build secret passageways through them, revealing our fears and hopes as shared currency. This connective tissue explains why storytelling outlasts slogans or sound bites. A policy debate might win an argument, but a well-told story wins allegiance not just to a cause, but to a vision of who we could be. The next chapter of this tale isn't about words on a page or pixels on a screen. It's about how these narratives, old and new, are quietly reprogramming the future. Some of the most electrifying stories being told today don't belong to any single culture. They're born at the crossroads where traditions collide and collaborate. Picture this: a Maori storyteller and a Sami poet crafting a spoken word piece that weaves together Polynesian creation chants with Arctic reindeer herding lore, their voices harmonizing in a festival hall in Reykjavik. Or a graphic novel anthology where Haitian Vodou deities meet Japanese yokai spirits, illustrated by artists from Port-au-Prince to Osaka. These aren't just creative experiments, they're diplomatic acts proving that when stories intertwine, they can build bridges no policy paper ever could. Take the Silk Road Stories project, where writers from 36 countries along the ancient trade routes co-authored a digital story cycle. A Persian folktale about a clever parrot might introduce a Chinese legend of a jade fox, with each transition composed collaboratively via video calls spanning time zones. The challenges were real, translating wordplay from Urdu to Hungarian without losing wit, or navigating taboos around certain mythological figures, but the rewards. A living tapestry showing how a Turkish shadow puppet's dilemma might mirror a Korean pansori singer's lament, revealing universal human threads beneath cultural finery. Theater has become a particularly vibrant lab for these fusions. The Global Hums initiative pairs indigenous throat singers from Mongolia, Canada, and the Amazon to create hybrid performances where Tuvan overtone singing blends with Kayapo warrior chants. Audiences don't just hear the music, they feel centuries of separate traditions conversing for the first time. Similarly, the Adinkra and Ainu project brought Ghanaian symbol-laden storytelling together with Japan's indigenous oral epics, resulting in a performance where Ainu fabric patterns danced alongside Ashanti proverbs, each element deepening the other's resonance. Yet these collaborations walk a tightrope. When Kenyan Griots adapt Norse sagas or Cherokee animators reimagine the Ramayana, who owns the resulting story? Projects like the Ethical Storytelling Charter have emerged, ensuring shared credit and veto power over sacred narratives. The Living Libraries program goes further, partnering elders from different cultures as co-narrators, not just borrowing stories, but exchanging the right to reinterpret them respectfully. A Yupik elder might teach a Senegalese storyteller the proper way to frame a sea spirit tale, while learning how to honor West African ancestor protocols in return. What makes these experiments vital isn't just their artistry, but their urgency. As climate change erases island nations whose creation myths are tied to vanishing shorelines, or as wars disperse refugee storytellers across continents, these collaborations become arcs preserving traditions that might otherwise sink beneath globalization's waves. The Endangered Stories Archive pairs linguists with last speakers of dying languages not to document grammar, but to record how a Selknam fire ceremony story from Tierra del Fuego might echo a Tasmanian Aboriginal Dreamtime narrative. In a world where a language dies every 2 weeks, these projects aren't just cultural exchanges, they're emergency surgeries for humanity's collective memory. Yet for all their promise, these fusions can't replace the ecosystems that birthed the original traditions. A beautifully animated version of a Tuvan shaman's tale may move millions online, but without the context of steppe winds and horsehide drums, something essential evaporates. That's why the most meaningful collaborations don't just blend stories, they sustain the communities who carry them. When the Roots and Routes Festival pays Inuit throat singers to teach in Glasgow schools or commissions Maori carvers to create story poles with Celtic knotwork, the focus isn't on extraction, but reciprocity, keeping ancient storytelling alive by letting it breathe new air. This delicate dance between preservation and evolution leads us to storytelling's most fragile frontier, the traditions teetering on silence's edge. Because once a story's last keeper passes without someone to whisper it forward, no algorithm or archive can truly bring it back. Some of the world's most vital stories aren't found in libraries or museums. They live in the memories of elders whose voices are fading with each passing season. In the remote valleys of the Caucasus, the last speakers of Ubik, a language with 81 consonants, take its epic poems to the grave. Along the Amazon, shamans who once recited creation myths spanning 5 generations now whisper them to empty huts as young people migrate to cities. These aren't just words disappearing, they're entire cosmologies, medicinal knowledge, and histories dissolving into silence. The scale is staggering. UNESCO estimates that of the world's 7,000 languages, over 40% are endangered, and with them, centuries of narrative wisdom. This crisis has sparked a global race against time to document what remains. Linguists armed with portable recording kits trek to Siberian tundras where Tofa reindeer herders describe spirits in the ice using words like baya, a term for the sound of snow collapsing underfoot that has no equivalent in any other tongue. Anthropologists work with Hawaiian kupuna to transcribe Oli chants that once navigated voyagers across the Pacific, their rhythmic cadences encoding wave patterns and star paths. Even high-tech solutions emerge, like the Rosetta Project's nickel discs etched with thousands of micro-printed languages designed to survive 5,000 years, a modern-day cave painting for the digital age. UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List has become an ark for these vanishing traditions, from the Azerbaijani art of Ashik storytelling to Mongolia's Urtian Du folk songs. But listing isn't enough. In Norway, the Sami Parliament funds story shelters, recording booths where elders preserve yoik songs that map Arctic landscapes through melody. Australia's Living Archive of Aboriginal Languages digitizes children's books written in endangered dialects during the 1970s, when bilingual education briefly flourished. These efforts reveal a painful truth. Preservation often begins only when a tradition is teetering on extinction's edge. The most innovative projects bridge generations through technology. The Cherokee Nation's language apps gamify animal stories with touchscreen animations, while VR headsets in New Zealand let Maori youth walk through digitally reconstructed villages from ancestral tales. In an ingenious twist, some linguists use AI to analyze patterns in oral histories, like how the Yupik people's stories from Alaska show subtle shifts in storm descriptions that match climate data, proving indigenous knowledge often anticipated scientific discovery. Yet for all these efforts, ethical dilemmas persist. When a German researcher records an Amazonian tribe's sacred origin story, who owns that recording? Can a digitized version of a Navajo chant, stripped from its ceremonial context, ever truly convey its meaning? Organizations like the Endangered Languages Archive now require dynamic consent, ongoing permission from communities about how their stories are used. Some take it further. The Mukatu Archive, developed with Australian Aboriginal groups, embeds cultural protocols into its software, preventing certain stories from being accessed by uninitiated users or women during sacred periods. What emerges is a paradox. The very act of preservation can sometimes drain stories of their lifeblood. A Tuvan throat singer's tale about mountain spirits loses its power when played through laptop speakers far from the echoing valleys that shaped it. The Hopi people's prophecy cycles, meant to be told only during specific lunar phases, resist freezing into recordings. Perhaps that's why some communities choose selective preservation, letting certain stories fade naturally while fighting to revive others, a cultural triage as heartbreaking as it is necessary. This tension between memory and evolution sets the stage for storytelling's next frontier, not just saving old narratives, but reimagining how they might live in futures we can barely envision. Because even as we race to document the past, new forms of storytelling are being born in the spaces between tradition and innovation, between the last whispers of the elders and the first words of the next generation's tales. The next frontier of storytelling might not be written by human hands at all. Picture an artificial intelligence that crafts personalized fairy tales for your child, altering the hero's appearance to match their own, or a virtual reality headset that drops you into the bustling markets of medieval Baghdad, where every merchant's greeting is dynamically generated to reflect your choices. We're standing at the edge of a revolution where algorithms can analyze thousands of folktales to generate new myths in the style of the Brothers Grimm, or where biofeedback sensors adjust a horror story's pacing based on your heartbeat. But this isn't just about flashy tech. It's about the most fundamental shift in how we share meaning since the first campfire tales. Already, prototypes hint at what's coming. In Japan, an AI named Bridget collaborates with human writers to produce light novels, its neural networks trained on centuries of samurai epics and modern manga. Meanwhile, the Living Archives project uses motion capture to preserve indigenous Australian dances, allowing future generations not just to watch, but to step into the movements of ancestors through augmented reality. The most intriguing experiments lie in interactive narratives like Netflix's Bandersnatch, but far more sophisticated. Imagine a historical drama where you play a Silk Road merchant, and every conversation branch pulls from real 14th century trade records, or an educational game where students negotiate peace treaties in a simulated Versailles, with AI diplomats responding based on deep archival research. Yet with these possibilities come thorny questions. Who owns a story generated by an AI trained on every Shakespeare play and West African griot recording? Can a digitally resurrected Mark Twain truly write a new novel, or is it just a sophisticated puppet? Indigenous groups are already fighting to prevent their oral traditions from being fed into story-generating algorithms without consent, arguing that sacred narratives lose their power when detached from living custodians. Even the notion of personalized stories raises concerns. If an algorithm only shows us narratives that align with our existing beliefs, do stories lose their power to challenge and expand our perspectives? Perhaps the most profound shift won't be in how stories are made, but in how they're experienced. Virtual reality could transform history lessons into emotional journeys, walking alongside enslaved people on the Underground Railroad, or hearing the whispers of scribes in the Library of Alexandria as flames creep closer. But will visceral immersion deepen empathy or reduce complex truths to mere spectacle? Early studies show mixed results. While VR Holocaust testimonials increase factual retention, some participants report feeling oddly detached, as if trauma had been gamified. Beneath these innovations pulses an ancient constant, our need to see ourselves reflected in stories. An AI might craft the perfect plot twist, but can it replicate the tremor in a griot's voice when recounting their grandmother's survival during colonization? A virtual reality reconstruction of ancient Rome can show us the forum's marble columns, but can it capture the smell of olive oil lamps or the weight of a gladiator's fear? The danger isn't that technology will replace human storytellers, it's that we might mistake technical marvel for emotional truth. As we hurtle toward this uncharted territory, one thing remains certain. Whether whispered around a fire or generated by quantum computers, stories will continue to do what they've always done: help us decipher the chaos of existence, connect across chasms of difference, and imagine futures brighter than our present. The tools are changing, but the heartbeat of storytelling, that primal urge to say, "Listen, this matters," will endure as long as there are humans to lean closer and say, "Tell me another." Stories don't just entertain, they dissolve the invisible walls between us, turning strangers into kindred spirits with shared heartbeats. Think about the surge of handwritten pandemic diaries that flooded the internet in 2020, where people from Tokyo to Toronto described their isolation in eerily similar words. A nurse in Milan scribbling about the ache of double masks mirrored a grandmother in Mumbai's account of singing to neighbors across balconies. These weren't just anecdotes, they became lifelines, proving that even when physically apart, humans instinctively reach for narrative as a bridge. Psychologists call this the narrative empathy effect. When we hear someone's story, our brains release oxytocin, the same bonding hormone that connects mothers and infants. It's why a single photo caption about a Syrian refugee's journey can spark more compassion than a spreadsheet of casualty statistics. History's darkest hours reveal storytelling's brightest sparks. During the Blitz in World War II, Londoners huddled in subway tunnels recited Chaucer and Shakespeare by candlelight, their voices weaving a sonic blanket against the bombs above. Centuries earlier, enslaved Africans on plantations transformed biblical stories into coded spirituals like Wade in the Water songs that mapped escape routes while soothing children's fears. Even in modern crises, this pattern holds. After the 2011 tsunami, Japanese survivors gathered in evacuation centers to share Cataribe oral histories of previous disasters, not just as warnings, but as proof that joy had returned before and would again. Trauma specialists now use these methods deliberately, helping wildfire survivors in California or war refugees in Ukraine process grief by framing their experiences as chapters rather than endings. The magic lies in story's dual role as both mirror and window. When a Finnish filmmaker documents Sami reindeer herders' struggles with climate change, urban viewers don't just learn about melting tundra, they feel the herders' calloused hands on the reins. A Pakistani grandmother's folktale about a clever crow outwitting eagles might resonate with an Appalachian miner's granddaughter, though their landscapes couldn't be more different. This universality explains why story exchanges like Humans of New York or StoryCorps go viral. They reveal our private struggles as variations on themes everyone recognizes: love, loss, resilience. But this connective power isn't passive. Consider the Library of Missing Books project, where refugees rebuilt a symbolic collection of titles lost in their homelands, each book's description telling the owner's story. Visitors didn't just read about a vanished library in Mosul. They held space for the college student who longed for her burned botany textbook, or the grandfather who missed his dog-eared copy of Rumi. Such projects prove stories don't just build empathy, they demand it, creating emotional debts that compel action. What emerges is a radical truth. Storytelling might be humanity's most sophisticated social technology. From prehistoric mothers describing constellations to calm, frightened children, to TikTok threads that turn personal struggles into global support networks, narratives transform isolation into communion. They're the original Wi-Fi, transmitting not data but meaning, and in a fractured world, that signal grows more vital by the day. The tales we share today aren't just links to the past, they're the scaffolding for futures we'll build together. From the flickering firelight of ancient caves to the glowing screens of our digital age, one truth remains unshaken: storytelling is the unbreakable thread woven through the tapestry of human experience. We began this journey tracing the handprints on Lascaux's walls, where early humans first turned, lived moments into shared meaning, and now find ourselves in an era where our eye can generate personalized fables at the tap of a finger. Yet whether told by a griot's resonant voice or algorithmically tailored to our preferences, stories still serve the same primal purpose: to make sense of chaos, to bind communities, and to whisper across time that you are not alone. Consider how every chapter of this tale reveals storytelling's dual nature, both mirror and lantern. Oral traditions like the Aboriginal songlines didn't just describe landscapes, they shaped how generations moved through them. The epics of Gilgamesh and Homer didn't merely entertain, they codified what civilizations valued most. Even today, a viral TikTok thread or a blockbuster superhero movie carries echoes of those ancient archetypes, proving that while our tools evolve, our hunger for narrative remains unchanged. Stories don't just reflect culture, they are culture, the invisible architecture of our identities, the silent curriculum of our moral imaginations. What's most extraordinary is how stories dissolve boundaries. A folktale from Ghana about Anansi the spider might feel worlds apart from a Norse myth of Loki, yet both tricksters teach us about wit's power over brute strength. A grandmother in Kyoto recounting the legend of the moon rabbit shares the same hushed wonder as a child in Nairobi hearing tales of the star-throwing maiden. This universality suggests something profound. Storytelling isn't just a human activity, it's what makes us human. Neuroscientists confirm this, showing that our brains sync when we hear the same story, releasing oxytocin to foster trust across divides of language or ideology. As we stand at this crossroads where our eye crafts narratives and VR immerses us in them, we do well to remember the wisdom of those who came before. The Native American proverb, "The one who tells the stories rules the world," wasn't about domination but stewardship. In an age of deepfakes and algorithmic echo chambers, we must wield stories with the same reverence as the shamans and scribes who understood their power to heal or harm, to unite or divide. The future of storytelling isn't just about dazzling technology, it's about preserving the sacred contract between teller and listener that began 45,000 years ago in a cave lit by torchlight. Let's leave the last word to the Chilean writer Isabel Allende, who once said, "Stories are like rivers, they keep flowing, they change course, but they always find their way to the sea." Yours are part of that current too, so tell us in the comments, what story shaped you? Was it a grandparent's wartime memory, a novel that cracked your heart open, or a game whose narrative stayed with you long after the console turned off? Hit subscribe to keep exploring how culture moves the world one story at a time. The campfire's still burning, and there's always room for one more voice in the circle.